Hello, everybody. Welcome to Plain Mundane Show. This is Alex. I'm glad you're here. Today, we're going to talk about trade relations, and we're going to talk about China mostly and the U.S. Now, as President Trump has said in many of his since his campaigning, that China has really gotten some great deals from the Americans, and we do not give ourselves enough in those deals, and we give everything away. And we need to impose tariffs and do things more reciprocally with China. But now it appears that other countries in the world, other major powers, also want China to lead the next world economy, especially in manufacturing. The United States will probably shift into more of a service industry role, such as the UK is. That's economically when you have an advanced economy and it starts to move away from industrialization into more securities and service industries, like insurance, securities, banking, any kind of white collar desk job that doesn't require building something or blowing smoke into the skies. Anyway, so let's read this article. Smoke into the skies. Anyway, so let's read this article. This is America Will Lose the Trade War Because That Is What Globalists Want to Happen by Brandon Smith on 15th of May in 2019 from the Alt Market website. Times of great political and social crisis can almost always be linked back to a common root cause: false paradigms. There are many people out there who have no clue what this phrase means, just as they have no clue what the phrase controlled opposition means. Some of these people are new activists to the liberty movement who recently joined because of the fervor of the Trump presidential campaign. They think the world of sovereignty and nationalism revolves around Trump because, frankly, they have been duped by a false paradigm themselves. False paradigms are a basic tactic of what is known as fourth-generation warfare. The purpose of fourth-generation warfare is described in the document From PSYOP to Mind War, a document circulated within the Department of Defense by the 7th Psychological Operations Group and written by now former General Paul Vallely, spelled Valley in the document, and former Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino. Where have we heard of him? A self-professed Satanist, believe it or not. I recommend it as a means to understand how globalists tend to think, how they use division to conquer populations, and to come to terms with the fact that these people are not held in check by empathy, morality, or reason. As far as fourth-gen warfare is concerned, Mind War describes a method of psychological manipulation and propaganda used by governments and militaries as a means to turn a target population against itself. The goal is to win a war against a group of people by causing them to destroy each other so that the government does not have to combat them directly. We've heard of this. False paradigms are a premier tool for pursuing this outcome. They are achieved by dividing a population through false leadership, fake and sometimes real outside threats, as well as manufactured crisis events. Globalist institutions and the political puppets they control use false paradigms as a means to distract public away from their criminal endeavors. While we are focused on the political left or the political right or the Russians or the Iranians or the Chinese, they are exploiting our fear and doubt to gain more centralization and more power. For globalists, the great prize is, of course, open global economic management rather than covert management, a one world currency, a cashless society, a global government. They want a veritable worldwide feudal plantation state, and they want the masses to embrace it willingly or perhaps even beg for it. To obtain this prize, they will need a considerable economic disaster. The U.S. economy and the dollar would have to be undermined. Now it's getting interesting to me because I know how this works. For Americans would not consent to global governance as long as our society remains relatively affluent and comfortable. See, folks, this is why the plans of all the elites in the societies globally are for the downfall of the American economy. And we're just puppets in the game. It's going to happen. But how is this being accomplished by the elites? What does the trade war have to do with their plans? The global banking elites and the controlled demolition of the U.S. I've been writing extensively on the controlled demolition of the U.S. economy for some time now. In January of 2018, I predicted in the Party While You Can, Central Bank Ready to Pop the Everything bubble, that Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve Fed would pursue policy tightening and would continue until the bubble in fundamentals, corporate debt, consumer debt, housing, retail, stock markets, etc. collapsed. So far, I've been proven correct. The fundamentals are plunging, and only stock markets remain. In the second quarter of 2019, the Fed is still cutting assets exponentially from its balance sheet and still refuses to pull interest rates back from their neutral rate of inflation, despite the predictions of many in the mainstream and alternative media. The Fed has used the tactic of addictive stimulus measures and artificially low interest rates to create massive financial bubbles in the past, and they almost always use tightening policies in times of economic weakness to deliberately pop those bubbles. For example, this is exactly what happened at the onset of the Great Depression. As former Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke openly admitted in 2002 in an address in honor of Milton Friedman. In short, according to Milton Friedman and Schwartz, because of institutional changes and misguided doctrines, the banking panics of the Great Contraction were much more severe and widespread than would have normally occurred during a downturn. Let me end my talk by abusing slightly my status as an official representative of the Federal Reserve. I would like to say to Milton and Anna regarding the Great Depression, you're right, we did it, we're very sorry. But thanks to you, we won't do it again. And yet, it is happening again today. As the economy nosedives, banking institutions buy up more hard assets and consolidate more power. Each time global economic management is suggested as a possible solution to the very crisis they created. My question has never been, will there be a crash? A crash of the U.S. is mathematically inevitable. It is happening now in an accelerated fashion and has been progressing in various ways since 2008. Instead, my question has always been, how do the globalists plan to get away with it? In Trump, A Trade War is a perfect smokescreen for a market crash, published in March of 2018, I outlined exactly how they plan to get away with it. In that article, I examined the strange number of similarities in policy and politics between Donald Trump and Herbert Hoover, including the use of large-scale tariffs right before the collapse of the U.S. financial system. While it was the Federal Reserve's interest rate increases into weakness and that exacerbated and prolonged the Great Depression for many years, it was Herbert Hoover's policies and sometimes the gold standard that were blamed for the crash. In other words, Donald Trump is following almost the exact same path as Herbert Hoover. And Trump's trade war with China is being used by the banking elites as cover for their sabotage of the U.S. economy. Who's sabotaging? Banking elites. Not China. In the end, it will be Trump and all of his populist followers that get the blame for the destabilization of our financial structure. The central bankers have a perfect scapegoat. Trump and the false left-right paradigm. I like this. But how could the banking elites and globalists possibly predict Trump's behavior in order to take advantage of it? Well, if you look at Trump's background as well as the number of elites he has placed within his own cabinet, the reality of the situation becomes clear. Trump is a puppet and always has been. And Trump is a Pied Piper for the New World Order. I outlined Trump's history with the banking elites, including his relationship with Rothschild banking agent Wilbur Ross, who bailed Trump out of his debts and saved him from the effects of bankruptcy in the 1990s. Trump's biggest campaign promise in 2016 was to drain the swamp in Washington, D.C. of the financial elitists and globalists that Hillary Clinton was so closely tied to. I'm going to interject right there. I don't think that's everything he was talking about when he said drain the swamp. There's people that need to be drained because of their actions and beliefs, not just because they're financial elitists and globalists. But when he entered the White House, he made Wilbur Ross Secretary of Commerce. He hired Goldman Sachs, like Steve Mnuchin and Gary Cohn. He's brought warmongering psychopathic think tank members like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo into his cabinet. Globalists don't have to predict Trump's behavior, they dictate Trump's behavior. Thus, the false left-right paradigm reigns supreme once again. The same paradigm many Trump followers thought they were escaping by rallying against a Clinton presidency. Current Trump cheerleaders completely ignore this fact, however. I've not seen a single one of them confront the issue of Trump's cabinet or his associations with the Rothschilds. They either ignore it outright or they claim Trump is keeping his enemies close or using their expertise to free America. This insanity, but it showcases the power that false paradigms have. Conservatives were so afraid of Clinton that they jumped on the bandwagon of Trump's controlled opposition administration, and they refuse to admit that they've been conned. How have globalists benefited from Trump being in the White House, though? Trump has gone on to attach his presidency so closely to the performance of the economy and primarily stock markets that any crash now undoubtedly he will be blamed. This is strange behavior if you consider his statements during his campaign, including the assertion that the Fed was deliberately keeping interest rates low to protect Obama and that the stock market was a giant fraudulent bubble. Today, Trump is demanding that the Fed funds rate be lowered, that the stimulus be renewed. He has been tweeting incessantly about how the economy under his watch is the greatest ever. To those who actually track the health of the U.S. economy, Trump's statements might seem delusional if you understand that Trump is controlled opposition and that he is playing the scripted role of a bumbling villain. His statements make perfect sense. Now that makes perfect sense. The U.S. economy is not the greatest it's ever been. In fact, it's the worst it's ever been since the crash of 2008, as evidenced in detail in The Crash in U.S. Economic Fundamentals is Accelerating. I assume is another book by this author of this article. Trump is wrapping himself around the implosion of the everything bubble as a mascot of fiscal destruction, and he's trying to drag all the conservatives with him. China and the false East-West paradigm. The other side of the control mechanism for a crash of this magnitude is on the other side of the world, China. It's not only Trump that has to act a certain way in order to cover the crash of the everything bubble. China must also play its role. The false East-West paradigm is perhaps the most pervasive of all the false paradigms, and for many in the liberty movement think that governments in China or Russia are opposed to the elites in the US and Europe. This is simply not true. China in particular has a long-time relationship with the Western globalists. In fact, modern China was essentially built by them. The Rockefeller family and the Rockefeller Foundation have been influenced Chinese social and political development since the late 1800s. I might add here, I remember, wasn't it, no, it was Kissinger, I'm sorry. He was over in Russia visiting Putin like 2 or 3 years ago. Remember that? Just, Kissinger just shows up and has secret meetings with Putin. What was that about? And nobody ever said. This started as seemingly innocuous, the relationship of China with the Rockefeller family, with the foundation initiating social and health-related programs in rural areas, but as noted by historians with access to the Rockefellers' archives, the Rockefellers were not seeking to display their capacity for philanthropic charity, but pursuing wide-reaching influence in Chinese society and politics. For more information, I recommend reading Frank Ninkovich's study, The Rockefeller Foundation, China and Cultural Change, of the Rockefellers' dominance in China for the past century in the Journal of American History. China's central bank is currently linked to the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS. That's the one out of Switzerland, Bern, which is often referred to as the central bank of central banks, and is admitted in an article in Harper's in 1983, Ruling the World of Money. That's where your SDRs are. Your specific deposit reserves that are, was there 5 currencies? And China just became one of them. This means Chinese central bank and Federal Reserve are both controlled by the globalists at the BIS. This is even more evident in recent years as all major central banks have operated at an odd level of coordination to prop up the stock markets of other nations, including stock markets of nations that are supposedly in conflict. China also works closely with the IMF. The yuan has been inducted into the SDR basket system, and China has called on multiple occasions for the SDR basket to replace the US dollar as the world reserve structure. The president of the IMF, she said, what's her name, Yellen, she said that they took in the yuan in the SDR basket of 5 currencies to hedge against the dollar, which means they know the dollar's going to crash. The IMF is openly discussing the introduction of a cashless digital currency system based on blockchain technology, which I believe will likely replace all currencies when the time comes. This means the trade war is a farce. When it comes to the elites of China and the US, there is no division and no conflict. They all want the same thing. Global centralization. The trade war smokescreen. For many years, I have warned that the next world war would be an economic world war between the East and West, and that this war would be engineered by globalists as a mass distraction while they introduced their one world economic system. The crux of that economic war would be the eventual dumping of U.S. treasuries by foreign central banks, as well as the dollar as the world reserve currency. What many pro-trade war people don't seem to realize is that the dollar's world reserve status was part of the original deal with China. China gained a trade surplus and access to U.S. markets. The U.S. gained a cheap labor pool, access to cheap goods, and U.S. currency was accepted by the Chinese as the foundation of international trade. But this dynamic no longer serves globalist interests in the new system they hope to create. As described in an article published in the Rothschild-run magazine, The Economist, in 1988, I had subscription to Economist for more than 25 years of my life. Let's see. The U.S. economy has to be brought down to pave the way for the new global currency system. Globalist Mohammed El-Erian confirmed this plan in a 2017 op-ed for The Guardian. And as globalist George Soros stated in 2009, China is intended to take a larger role in the IMF and become the economic engine for the New World Order, while the U.S. is set to take a backseat in global affairs as the rest of the world moves away from the dollar. This might be why the U.S. 10-year Treasury auctions are seeing dismal results, and why the Chinese are now willing to threaten the dumping of U.S. T-bonds through their state-run media. China is not folded to U.S. tariffs as so many people have been predicting for the last year. In fact, China has dug in even further. China is the number one exporter-importer in the world. They now set the standard for international trade, not the U.S. If China follows through on threats to dump U.S. treasuries, or if they dump the dollar as the world reserve, then most, if not all, their trading partners will do the same. The consequences would be devastating for the U.S. economy, which has a minimal manufacturing base and is utterly reliant on the international acceptance of the dollar to keep prices low and prop up what's left of our financial structure. While proponents of the trade war keep insisting that manufacturing will come back to the U.S., this is still not materialized. Why would corporations spend all the money to rebuild factories in the U.S. when they can simply stay in Asia and use the existing factories and cheap labor? There is no incentive for them to come back. If tariffs go higher, they can easily raise prices on consumers to support their bottom line. The U.S. is being set up for a spectacular fall. Those that claim China would never make such a move don't understand the Chinese economy. The U.S. is only 18% of Chinese exports, and U.S. consumption has been declining. The vast majority of China's GDP comes from domestic consumption, and the claim that China is dependent on U.S. markets to survive is one of the most widely perpetuated lies of the past decade. The Chinese will take a hit to their economy, certainly, but nowhere near the hit the U.S. economy will take if they cut off the dollar as the primary trade mechanism. The trade war only makes sense if you look at it from the globalist perspective. China will get hurt to an extent. The U.S. will suffer an economic disaster it will never recover from, and only the globalists truly benefit. With tensions increasing, probably through the end of 2019, I suspect the Federal Reserve will increase cuts to their balance sheet under cover of the trade war. I also suspect that China's central bank will finally cut off stimulus measures which have been keeping global stocks afloat for the past 4 months. This will eventually trigger the crash of the markets on top of already plunging fundamentals. The U.S. will lose the trade war. Trump and conservatives will be blamed for the collapse. China will already be pre-positioned as the next economic engine for the world. The IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, and BIS will introduce their one world currency system as the solution to the problem they created. The BIS is the Bank of International Settlements. That's the one in, I believe, in Bern, Switzerland, or is it Geneva? And they control 5 world currencies that they hold all of their capital in, all of their reserves. If it's not gold, it's in only 5 world currencies that they consider the strongest ones. And there used to only be 4. And when the dollar started getting weak, they added the Chinese yuan. That's what this article is about. Now China's an SDR currency, a world reserve currency. Do you know that Russians don't buy petroleum with dollars anymore? They used to have to. And it used to be if you went to Saudi Arabia, you had to pay for your oil in dollars. Now you don't have to. So that bond and that era regime of empire wealth has been cut off. Whether or not they succeed in this plan will greatly depend on whether or not enough people set aside their biases and accept the whole thing was a farce from the very beginning. Trade war. All right, folks. I like that picture. That's a nice picture. Who looks more confident in that picture? Maybe President Trump has other things on his mind, but that president, the Chinese premier, he looks a little confident in that handshake too, doesn't he? You know, the thing is, we're reading about this as if it's the future, but it's already there. They are the world's biggest exporter and importer already, and they already are a reserve world currency in the BIS. You know? So, thank you for coming to the Plain Mundane Show. Please hit like, subscribe, ring the bell for more videos when I put them up, and I will talk to you later.